Oh, here we are again. Good to see you. Suppose you believe that the great hope of this world lies in the possibility of a new revelation of Jesus and a new and expanded revelation of his saving message, which would unite in loving service the numerous families of his present-day professed followers. Now, if you believed this and wanted to work on this project, as it were, in a way that was evolutionarily wise, you would want to know about what scholars call the historical Jesus. And that means two things, really. It means who Jesus really was, what he really said and did. And it also means Jesus as apprehended through the lenses of the social sciences. Now, what I want to share with you today is a book that I just finished by John Dominic Crossan. It's titled The Historical Jesus, and the subtitle is A Mediterranean Jewish Peasant. So here we go for a relatively quick introduction to that book. It begins with an overture. There's a 3-page summary of Crossan's narrative on the life of Jesus. And that's followed by a 25-page presentation of sayings of Jesus, mostly taken from the New Testament Gospels, but not all. And the emphasis is that these are not simply to be read, but like a musical score, to be read and lived. It's about performance and action. And after that overture comes a prologue, a methodological program that I'll discuss a bit at the end. And then the book unfolds in 3 parts. The first part is titled The Brokered Empire. Empire refers to the Roman Empire. And the concept of brokerage is crucial here. We can't look it up and, in a quick dictionary and get an understanding that expresses what Crossan has in mind when he looks at the ancient Greco-Roman world or Hellenistic world in which Jesus lived. The idea of a broker was that because you had a social structure, which, to put it simply, had an upper class that was rich, no prosperous middle class, and the rank and file of humanity languished in misery and poverty. All right, so in order to get ahead in life with anything, you needed the help of someone who was higher up on the totem pole, and you tried to associate with someone who could, as it were, broker power and influence to you to help you get your needs met in this life. So there was a personal relationship, a network of personal relationships of persons with less influence and more influence, and sometimes they were on the same level. You come for me for this, and you come to me for this, and I'll come to you for that. We help each other out to get things done. And it was not a cash economy mediated by a bureaucracy that was impersonal and trying to apply universal law to every case. You know, it was a different kind of society. Power was arranged very differently. And in religion, brokerage could mean functioning, if I may say so, like a shaman, as an intermediary between God and the individual. So you had priests who functioned in that way in some sense, and this was the texture. Okay, part one is the brokered empire. Now, there were lots of things that were unhappy, and there were different. Part two is titled Embattled Brokerage. These were the various movements that clashed in one way or another with the social and political and religious system of the Roman Empire and the Jewish domain of Palestine in the time of Jesus. And the part three is called the brokerless kingdom. That's what Jesus proclaimed and practiced. All right, so now you've got an overview. Here's the a one-paragraph summary of the book that's given in the epilogue at the very end. Jesus was heavily influenced by a Gentile philosophy in the ancient world called cynicism. Now I quote, "His work was among the farms and villages of Lower Galilee. His strategy, implicitly for himself and explicitly for his followers, was the combination of free healing and common eating, a religious and economic egalitarianism, idea everyone is equal, that negated alike and at once the hierarchical and patronal normalcies of Jewish religion and Roman power." This the patron and client was one of the pervasive structures of brokerage in this ancient Greco-Roman sense that Crossan describes. And lest he, Jesus, himself be interpreted simply as the new broker of a new God, he moved on constantly, setting down neither at Nazareth nor Capernaum. He was neither broker nor mediator, but somewhat paradoxically, the announcer that neither should exist between humanity and divinity, or between humanity and itself. In other words, as a friend of mine used to say, deal directly with God. To quote, continue the quote, "Miracle and parable, healing and eating were calculated to force individuals into unmediated physical and spiritual contact with God, and unmediated physical and spiritual contact with one another." He announced, in other words, the brokerless kingdom of God. Now, the central chapter in this book is chapter 13, which is titled Magic and Meal. And here's the first, the epigraph on this, a quote from Joseph Klausner that precedes the beginning of the text. "The complete visionary and mystic exerts an influence only upon other visionaries like himself, and his influence soon passes. The man of practical wisdom, alert in worldly matters only, merely influences the brain while leaving his heart untouched. And never in this world was anything great achieved unless the heart, deeply stirred, has played its part. Only where mystic faith is yoked with practical prudence does there follow a strong, enduring result. and of such a nature was the influence exerted by Jesus of Nazareth upon his followers, and through them upon succeeding generations. Okay, now I'm going to give you some of what I find so exciting about Crossan's extraordinary book. It's the most stunning book on the historical Jesus that I have ever read, and I've read a few. The central chapter, again, is chapter 13, and it builds on four main strands of research that have been discussed previously, including most of all the work of Brian Wilson. Now, I'm quoting from the very first page now, where Wilson's, well, let's see, no, this quote goes back to page 73, way earlier than chapter 13. Brian Wilson has written a fascinating study on religious movements of protest among tribal and third world peoples. But that work is especially useful because it proposes a sevenfold typology based on the diverse ways in which people respond to the world when salvation from evil is no longer found adequately within the standard religious resources of their tradition. Granted, of course, the diverse meanings of evil and therefore of any transcendent salvation from it, and using the word God as in Brian's phrase, Wilson's phrase, the convenient symbol. God is the convenient symbol for supernatural power, however that power is conceived and designated in particular cultures. Wilson established 7 reactions grouped in 3 sets according to where the emphasis falls among the movement of response to the world. The first group is conversionists, who as subjectivists place primary emphasis on response to the world. They believe that God will change us. Since the world is corrupt because people are corrupt, salvation comes only through a profoundly felt, supernaturally wrought transformation of the self. Next are 2 groups who, as relationists, place primary emphasis on response to the world. You've got manipulationists who believe that God calls us to change perception. People must learn the right means, facilities, technologies, so as to alter their relation to the world, to see the world differently. And thaumaturgists, this is where Crossan classifies Jesus. It means wonder workers, or in his frequent phrase, magicians, believe that God will grant particular dispensations and work specific miracles. Salvation is conceived much more narrowly than in the preceding case, is particularistic, personal, local, and magical, and is very difficult to generalize, organize, and ideologize. Finally, there are 4 groups who, as objectivists, place primary emphasis on response to the world. Revolutionists believe that God will overturn the world. In this case, only the destruction of the world, of the natural, but more specifically of the social order, will suffice. This presumes divine and imminent action with or without human participation. Introversionists believe that God calls us to abandon the world. It is so irredeemably evil that one must withdraw completely, either alone or with and into a separated community, preoccupied with its own holiness and its means of insulation from the wider society. Reformists believe that God calls us to amend the world. This response is very close to secular improvement programs, except that it presumes supernaturally given insights about the ways in which social organization should be amended. And finally, utopians believe that God calls us to reconstruct the world. This presumes some divinely given principles of reconstruction, is much more radical than the reformist alternative, but unlike the revolutionist option, insists much more on the role human beings must take in the process. Now, I bring forward this quote because I personally believe that it connects in so many ways with our world today. And Crossan and Wilson, of course, do not imagine that there aren't combinations and degrees and blends between these various types. But here in the beginning of chapter 13 is the way that Crossan restates some of Wilson's conclusions. He refers to Brian Wilson's sevenfold anthropological and cross-cultural typology of protest movements among colonial peoples. Now, a long quote from Wilson. Men may seek salvation from evil conceived in many forms. From illness, anxiety, illness, inferiority feelings, grief, fear of death, concern for the social order. What they seek may be healing, the elimination of evil agents, a sense of access to power, the enhancement of status, increase of prosperity, the promise of life hereafter, or reincarnation, or resurrection from the grave, or attention from posterity, the transformation of the social order, including the restoration of a real or imagined past social order, of the various theodicies, which are ways of portraying harmony between the truth of an ideal deity and the facts of suffering and evil, of the various theodicies that organize appropriate promises and command the appropriate activities to cope with these specific apprehensions of evil. Two responses are widely found among the less developed peoples: the thaumaturgical, wonder-working or magical, and the revolutionist. Furthermore, the thaumaturgical response is a recurrent and as yet inextinguishable characteristic of religion. It outcrops in all great religious traditions and more vigorously and with far fuller expectation of effectiveness in the movements which espouse a different, deviant response to the world. It stands in tension, often, with the revolutionists' response. And here I close my quote. It's not all a quote from Wilson, it's almost completely Crossan's summary of Wilson that you just got. Now, you'll need to look at the blog post in order to have your own copy of this. Plus, well, this methodological prologue, which I find so extraordinarily, and of course, I have my differences from it as a philosopher, but I find it just brilliant and exciting. Crossan works with three disciplines, each highly developed. Social anthropology that hazards generalizations across space and time, Hellenistic or Greco-Roman history, and a mastery of the literature of specific sayings and doings, stories and anecdotes, confessions and interpretations concerning Jesus. Writes Crossan, it is clear, I hope, that my methodology does not claim an impossible objectivity, because almost every step demands a scholarly judgment and an informed decision. I am concerned not with unattainable objectivity, but with an attainable honesty. The selected data need to be placed in their historical situation and literary relationship, not because that eliminates controversy, but so that a reader knows where one stands on every issue. Every step is more or less controverted, but that fact demands, rather than excuses, a clear stand on each problem. And for those of you who are now thinking of actually getting a copy and reading this amazing book, I give you this warning. If you're going to follow it authentically, you've got to understand the notation that Crossan uses. And to get that, you've got to learn it on page Roman numeral 33, XXXIII, at the end of this prologue. And that will be enough for this video audio file today. All good to every one of you, sons and daughters of the living God.